Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. This podcast is designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know, all in 20 minutes. I am your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. If you like what you hear, then please rate and review on Apple or Google Podcasts. Thank you to all of you who have left a review. It's really very much appreciated. I read every single one. You've wanted videos. You want podcasts to be longer and also for better quality transcripts. And in light of that, we have made a few changes. We are now inviting you to become our patron, which will financially support the podcast. You can support our work and the unique content we provide from as little as £5. For more information of how to support us and or to access recommended readings and related blog posts, please go to londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast. Get that cup of tea, put your feet up and enjoy. Joining me today in the studio, hello, is City of London tour guide Ian McDiarmid.
Hello, Hazel.
So today's episode is all about leper houses of London. We're going to look at where they were and the reasons for that, and also the medieval view of lepers compared to our own modern sensibilities. Ian, what is it about medieval leprosy that you find so particularly interesting?
One of the things that I think is interesting about leprosy and a lot of illnesses is the stigma that goes with it, really. And it's rather odd, isn't it, that people who are ill should be stigmatized for their suffering, but amongst the stigmatized illnesses, leprosy, I guess, figures pretty much towards the top of the list.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I think of leprosy, I don't really think of London at all. My mind goes to Jesus Christ Superstar and the Lepers song and biblical times, really. Don't really think of it coming to these shores and having so much of an effect. But we're going to be learning a little bit different, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And following from what you're saying, one of the interesting aspects of this is that there is nothing left of these London leper houses, but they were an important part of the urban fabric.
Let's get down to basics. So what is leprosy?
Well, it's a disease that we now know is caused by bacteria. So the bacterium was isolated in the 19th century, and it won't surprise you, it was called Mycobacterium leprae, and it was isolated by a man named Hansen. And talking of stigma, in clinical circles, it is no longer referred to as leprosy because of the stigma, and it is called Hansen's disease after this man. It has, even today, some interesting characteristics. One is that it's quite hard to pass on from one individual to another. Secondly, it's not necessarily particularly well understood. I don't think it's clear to people working in the field why it is that certain individuals are disposed to getting it whilst others living in close proximity to them don't. And when Hansen isolated it in the 1860s, he was doing this at a time when there's this great expansion in the use of the microscope. And the great German clinician Koch has said that you need to be able to do three things to identify a disease that's transmitted by bacteria. And one is you need to isolate the bacterium. Secondly, you need to be able to culture it. And thirdly, you need to be able to inoculate people. And Hansen could do the first one, but he couldn't do the other two parts of it, which gives an indication of what a tricky illness it is. It's also tricky because there are two basic kinds of the disease. So there's lepromatous or lepromatus, not quite sure on the pronunciation, and there is tuberculoid, and tuberculoid is the less severe form of it. And tuberculoid leprosy basically affects only parts of the body, whereas lepromatous affects all of it. So the body's defences in the case of lepromatous are completely overwhelmed over a period of time. In terms of diagnosis, they diagnose it as one of those two, but also they can diagnose it as indeterminate. So it can be indeterminate lepromatous and indeterminate tuberculoid, and then they've got one in the middle called indeterminate, which indicates to me that there's not a huge amount of clinical precision even today in identifying the disease. It's a disease that affects the skin, obviously. It affects the peripheral parts of the body, in particular, the nerves on the peripheral parts of the body. And it can affect the nose and mouth in particular, but also the eyes. And when it affects peripheral parts of the body, people lose sensation, and they can get wounds which then become infected. And that also, with the tendency of bone to disappear, causes the deformities, the loss basically of peripheral body parts. So one of the big characteristics of the disease is its disfiguring effect on people. And one thing we need to bear in mind with regard to how lepers are regarded is that one symptom is fetid breath as a result of the illness.
So the only leper hospital that I know of in London, so I'm looking forward to learning more today, was in St Giles.
Yes. So there were about 8 leper hospitals around London, and there were 3 big ones. And the big ones were St Giles, which was on the site of the Church of St Giles in the Fields. The other 2 big ones are St James, which is easy to identify because it's the current site of St James's Palace. That's where St James's Palace gets its name from, so just to the north of Westminster. And the other big one was the Lock, or Les Locks, as they perhaps called it, in Southwark, and that was located at the milestone to the south of London Bridge. And then there are some smaller ones as well. So there's one at Hackney, for which there are records by about 1330, but it's probably older than that. And then to these sort of 4 are added some more. So there's one at Knightsbridge, there's one at Mile End, there's one at Hackney. Those are all founded by the corporation. And there's an obscure reference to one at Hammersmith. And then there's a rather interesting one at Highgate. And this is formed in the reign of Edward IV. So we're talking sort of 1470s, and this is one of his yeomen of the guard falls sick with leprosy, a man named William Pole, and Edward grants him a piece of land to form a leper hospital. But what's rather interesting is that this leper hospital was never for more than 2 or 3 residents, so it's very, very small. One of the problems with our leper houses in London, but with leprosy as a whole, in England in particular, is a lack of documentation. So it's very difficult to reconstruct the history of it. And it'd be very interesting to know how many lepers there were, what portion of the population suffered from leprosy, and we have no idea. One of the things that I think is interesting is the small number of people that were accommodated in these hospitals. So I was saying that we've got the 3 big ones. Of the 3 big ones, in terms of inmates, or perhaps that's the wrong word, but people of lepers, the largest was St Giles, which was originally founded for 40 lepers, I think. Saying that they later on they go into a decline. By the 14th century, that looks like it's down to 14. And then St James the Less is founded for 14 nuns. So the nuns were lepers. So it's looking after 14 people. So although we're talking about London here, they aren't accommodating very many lepers. And this might indicate that there weren't that many lepers. But I mean, that's not really a safe conclusion, because it could well be that a lot of lepers didn't go into leper hospitals. In
my mind, when you were mentioning that, Southwark, Highgate, Mile End, Hammersmith, if I was going to map that out, they're basically a ring around London, aren't they?
Yes, and this is of enormous importance. So there's a very, very good book on leprosy in medieval England by Carol Rawcliffe, and I'd like to put a link in the notes. I was going to say I'll put a link in the notes, but perhaps in the interest of strict accuracy, I will ask you, Hazel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And her basic theme on this is to sort of challenge pre-existing concepts of the leper as being completely isolated, and showing that they actually lived in a kind of in-between world between inclusion and exclusion in medieval life. And this location of these leper houses, or leprosaria as they were known, is extremely important, because they form a ring round London, as you're saying, and they also tend to be on main roads. So the St Giles is on the main road from Oxford and then from Tyburn into London. The St James is obviously near Westminster. The one in Southwark is main roads coming in from the south of the Thames to cross London. You're going to go past one of these leper hospitals. And St Giles, when it's founded in the early 12th century, is founded about a mile outside the city of London. So these are built outside the city, but close to it, and you'll come across them as you come into the city. And as I say, this is important. And they're also, it's not just a ring, they're on major routes into London. And I think there are various important reasons for this kind of building them apart, but building them as part of the city. And the reasons for exclusion are the ones that you might imagine, and ones which fit in with the sort of cliched view of the leper. And these are to do with primarily actually exclusion because it says in the Bible that they're unclean and that they need to be kept without the camp. But they were also from the off worried about contagion. Their fears about contagion vary over time. So they, particularly after the Black Death, people get very worried about the effects of bad air, the fetid breath of lepers. But even before then, they are to some extent concerned about contagion. So it makes sense to have them outside. And then there's also this injunction in Leviticus to keep the lepers without. But they're on the main roads, so it's very easy for the lepers to beg. They're on the main roads, presumably also for convenience, because it's relatively easy to keep them supplied with needs. But perhaps most important is that they're part of the kind of spiritual architecture of London. So if you imagine coming into London, these are the first institutions that you come across. And you will then enter, you will then approach the city walls, and you'll come across just lying outside, sometimes just within the city walls, you'll come to the big friaries and priories of London. And then you'll get into London proper. And within a city largely built of timber, the buildings that already stand out are the parish churches. And then bang in, well, not really bang in the middle, but bang in the middle in terms of dominating a prominent hill is this huge, enormous church of St. Paul's. And in addition to this kind of architecture of spirituality, you've got all the activities going on within London. So you've got guilds, and we did a podcast on guilds when we were talking about craft guilds.
Yes, we'll include that in the show notes as well, so people can find it.
The craft guilds exist to promote the spiritual welfare of their members and also to promote their economic interests. But the craft guilds are only a small minority of the guild phenomenon as a whole. There are far more guilds just purely dedicated to religious purposes in London. And then in addition to that, you've also got the interesting phenomenon of hermits, anchorites and anchoresses. And hermits, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, they sort of live a solitary life, but they can wander around. Anchorites and anchoresses are locked and sometimes, according to the literature, immured, built into cells. So they make the decision to become an anchorite or an anchoress, and they're sort of locked up for the rest of their lives in a single cell. And there was, for example, one anchoress in the gateway to Blackfriars. They're enormously important. And the importance of all these institutions, they're doing religious things for their own benefit. So you can go and say prayers for yourself or whatever. But the point is that you've got all these anchorites and anchoresses, you've got all these guilds, got all these churches, got all this religious activity going on, and in particular you've got all these masses going on. And this is of great benefit not just for the individuals concerned, but for the whole community. And this is the important thing. And I think this is the real importance of these leper houses, because the leper, they are regarded as being unclean, but at the same time they're also regarded as being rather like the figure of Job, suffering through bodily affliction, and then therefore closer to God and in a sense spiritually clean. And as a result of their sufferings, their intercessionary prayers are regarded as being particularly effective. And one thing, I was saying that the sources aren't particularly great. So, for example, at St Giles, we don't know what kind of religious order the people there belong to. St James is the one house that we know that the women there, we know that they had to formally enter into a religious order in order to become cared for in the hospital. And there were 14 nuns there, and there were 8 Augustinian canons to look after their spiritual needs. But everywhere, when you entered into a leper hospital, you had vows that were similar to those entering monastic orders, so poverty, obedience, chastity. And the day followed a similar day to in monasteries, in that it was based on the canonical hours. Now, they had to make some adaptation because lepers come from all ranks of society. Mm-hmm. And lepers won't necessarily be familiar with Latin, so they adopted the liturgy to have prayers in English. But it's very important that these lepers are coming under religious discipline, and it's it's in part because their prayers are regarded as so important by the rest of the community. On this religious thing, the other thing is that the people endowing these leper hospitals, they get great benefits because they've got the inmates praying for their souls afterwards. And as I said, great intercessory power in terms of speeding you out of purgatory.
Nice get out of jail free card there.
Yeah.
So this goes really against what we think of when we think of lepers then, isn't it?
Yes. Well, Rawcliffe in her book, as I say, she's very good on talking about this. And she says that the modern view of the leper really only develops in the 19th century, that is, of the leper as being somebody who's completely excluded. She says that this comes about primarily because there's a small resurgence of leprosy in Europe in the 19th century, and they don't know how to deal with it. And one school of thought is that these lepers should be segregated in leper hospitals. And then the physicians arguing this, then along with the historians, went back to the sources to argue that this was how things were done in medieval times, and that they had successfully contained leprosy in the Middle Ages by isolating people. And Rawcliffe illustrates this by examples of 19th century culture. So she cites literature and some paintings of how lepers were depicted in the 19th century. And then, but it got me thinking about horror films. So there are lots of influences on horror films, Gothic novels. I think the First World War has a huge impact, particularly on something like Phantom of the Opera. But the one that I was thinking about was zombies. Now, zombies obviously have their origin in a particular tradition, that of voodoo magic from Haiti, but they are remarkably close to the modern concept of the leper. Because I'm not a very well-informed student of zombie films, but whenever I've seen bits of them, they're always covered. The zombies are always wearing what we might popularly think of lepers as wearing, that sort of hooded, rather monk-like garbs, rather greasy, with the face covered. And obviously there's some kind of connection between zombies as the living dead and the popular view of lepers as being kind of living dead in the sense of being isolated and shut away. And then you suggested that I watch that bit of Jesus Christ Superstar, which is, forgive me if I'm quoting it wrongly, I want to say the Leper song, but that sounds like something...
Yeah, no, you're right. It's called the Leper song.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Sounds like something out of Monty Python. But anyway, I watched that, and there the connection is made absolutely explicit, because these lepers they're zombies, aren't they? I mean, they crowd round the figure of Jesus in a sort of frightening, clawing way. And then there's one bit when one of the lepers crawls out of a hole, crawls back in again. I mean, he's just like a zombie. So, yeah, the modern view of them is not being sympathetic.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. Once again, you are a font of all knowledge. And, wow, I mean, leprosy and zombies, who knew they went together? I will not be able to watch a Michael Jackson Thriller in the same way ever again.
Yeah, I've forgotten all about him. Thank you for reminding me, yeah.
And I'll put the Leper song from Jesus Christ Superstar, I'll embed that into the show notes as well, if you want to know what on earth we are going on about.
Yeah.
So Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure, Hazel.
If you've enjoyed this episode, then we have 3 other medieval episodes that you also might enjoy. Episode 41, London's Medieval Friaries. 38, The Black Death, London's First Plague. And episode 32, Medieval Guilds, all with City of London tour guide Ian McDiarmid. It's all we've got time for today's episode, but we do have the full-length feature of Ian McDiarmid's talk about leprosy. It's 45 minutes long, and also we have a video version for our patrons on patreon.com/London History. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.